did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it, and I read it to her in there. And I did sort of feel
Something just snapped behind palace walls, and this time it didn't come from Prince Harry or Meghan Markle. It came from the one man who has stayed silent for decades. Until now, Charles Spencer, the keeper of Princess Diana's memory, has finally stepped forward. And what he's done is sending shockwaves straight through the Sussex camp. Because this isn't just a disagreement, this feels like a line has been crossed. For years, Charles Spencer said nothing. Nothing when headlines spiraled. Nothing when narratives twisted. Nothing when Diana's name echoed across interviews, documentaries, and carefully curated public moments. Silence. Controlled, intentional, almost eerie. But silence, when held too long, starts to build pressure, and now it looks like that pressure has exploded. And the timing? It couldn't be more suspicious. Because suddenly, just as Harry and Meghan appear desperate to reclaim momentum, just as their media empire starts wobbling under scrutiny, just as the whispers around their future grow louder, Charles Spencer re-enters the conversation. Not gently, not subtly, but with questions sharp, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Why now? That's the question no one in the Sussex circle seems ready to answer. Because this isn't just about a disagreement over storytelling. This is about ownership, legacy, control over a narrative that was never supposed to be rewritten. Althorpe House, the place where Diana rests, the place that has remained almost frozen in time, untouched by chaos, guarded by silence. That silence used to feel respectful. Now it feels strategic, because from that quiet estate, something shifted in early 2026, and insiders suggest the reaction from within those walls wasn't calm. It was firm, immediate, almost offended. And when you understand who Charles Spencer really is, the weight of this moment becomes impossible to ignore. He isn't just Diana's brother. He's the man who stood before the world at her funeral in front of billions and challenged the very institution that shaped her life. He made promises, bold ones, promises to protect her sons from the very pain that defined her existence. Promises that sounded emotional in the moment, but now, years later, feel like unfinished business. Because what happens when the story starts repeating itself? That's where things start getting uncomfortable. Patterns began to emerge slowly, subtly at first. Meghan Markle wearing Diana's jewelry, referencing her style, echoing her emotional tone in interviews that felt strangely familiar. Coincidence? Tribute? Or something more calculated? The public noticed. Of course they did. But what about Charles Spencer? From Althorpe, the comparisons didn't feel flattering. They felt dangerous. Because Diana's story wasn't just a narrative, it was a warning. And yet here we are again. Interviews mirroring past confessions. Media projects drawing emotional parallels. A growing sense that history isn't just being remembered, it's being reassembled, repackaged, reinterpreted, and then came the proposal that may have pushed everything too far. A documentary. A major one. Positioned as a tribute. Marketed as emotional. But beneath the surface, a narrative linking Diana's struggles directly with Meghan's journey, blending past and present into a single story of resistance, pain, and public scrutiny. On paper, it sounds powerful, but to Charles Spencer, it sounded like something else entirely. And when that proposal reached him, something shifted instantly. Expectations were high, approval seemed almost assumed, but what came back instead was a response so blunt, so unexpected. It immediately changed the entire trajectory of the project. Is this a joke? 4 words. Cold, final, and impossible to walk back. That wasn't hesitation. That was rejection. And with that, the entire foundation of the documentary began to collapse. Because without access to Althorpe, without private archives, without the silent approval of the man who controls Diana's legacy, the project loses its authenticity, its emotional core, its credibility. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. This isn't just about a documentary being denied. This feels personal. Because behind that rejection is something deeper, something unresolved, a history Charles Spencer has never fully spoken about, the aftermath of Diana's most vulnerable moments, the consequences of media exposure that spiraled beyond control, the lingering regret that still shadows everything connected to her story. And now, history is knocking again. But this time, he's not staying silent. And that raises a dangerous question. If Charles Spencer has finally chosen to speak, what exactly is he trying to stop? And just when it seemed like the fallout couldn't get worse, it did. Because the rejection of that documentary didn't just shut a door, it exposed something far more fragile hiding beneath the surface. The Sussex empire, the one built on visibility, storytelling, and carefully managed perception, is now facing a pressure point that looks dangerously close to cracking. Behind the scenes, the whispers are getting louder, the numbers are being questioned, and the one partnership that was supposed to secure their global influence, the Netflix deal, is now being described as unstable. Not publicly, of course, never publicly. But in industry circles, the tone has shifted. Confidence has been replaced with doubt, and it all comes back to performance. Because while attention was never a problem for Meghan Markle, approval suddenly is. Her latest project didn't just receive criticism, it triggered something sharper, a kind of collective skepticism that's harder to control. Reviews weren't just negative, they were cutting, dismissive, almost personal. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Visibility without validation starts to look like noise. The show generated conversation, yes, headlines, yes, but beneath that, a growing sense that something isn't connecting, that the audience isn't buying what's being presented anymore. And when critics start describing your work as hollow, self-focused, or disconnected, that's not just feedback, that's a warning, because this isn't their first stumble. There was initial success, of course. The early docuseries pulled massive numbers, fueled by curiosity and timing. But what followed? A noticeable decline. Projects that didn't land, stories that didn't resonate, momentum that quietly slowed down while the public kept watching and judging. And now the stakes are higher than ever, because without a defining success, the entire Netflix partnership starts to feel uncertain. Renewal becomes a question mark. Future projects become negotiations instead of guarantees. And suddenly, that $100 million deal doesn't look like security, it looks like pressure. Which brings everything back to that documentary. Because now it makes sense, doesn't it? Why the urgency? Why the push? Why Diana's legacy became the center of the next big idea? It wasn't just about storytelling, it was about survival. A project powerful enough to reset the narrative, emotional enough to pull audiences back in, significant enough to justify everything that came before. But Charles Spencer saw through it, and he said no. And that no didn't just block access, it disrupted a strategy. Meanwhile, across the royal divide, another tension is quietly intensifying. Prince William, silent, watching, not reacting publicly, but reportedly deeply uncomfortable with how his mother's legacy keeps reappearing in these modern narratives. His position is complicated. As the future king, every move is calculated. Every reaction carries consequences. So he says nothing. But silence doesn't mean approval. And that silence, according to insiders, is starting to feel heavier. Because while William holds back, Charles Spencer doesn't have to. His authority isn't institutional, it's personal, emotional, rooted in memory, not protocol. And that's what makes his intervention so powerful. It changes the dynamic completely. Now it's not just a royal disagreement, it's a family fracture with two very different kinds of power colliding: public influence versus private guardianship. And caught in the middle of it all, Prince Harry, once the bridge between two worlds, now increasingly isolated between them, because the perception around him is shifting, quietly but unmistakably, from independent figure to someone being pulled by forces outside his control, from prince with purpose to a man trying to keep up with a narrative that keeps slipping away from him. And that's exactly what Charles Spencer reportedly fears most, not just the use of Diana's legacy, but what it's doing to Harry himself. Because if the story keeps repeating, if the same patterns keep unfolding, then the promise he made all those years ago starts to feel like it's unraveling in real time. And that's something he may not be willing to watch again. So now the situation sits on a knife's edge: a rejected documentary, a fragile media deal, a divided family, and a legacy that refuses to stay quiet. But here's the question no one can answer yet. If this is Charles Spencer stepping in, what happens if he decides this isn't enough?